Well, this week we are continuing with a brief series I've called Living as Disciples. It's always good for us to think about during this time of year, after the resurrection, after Easter Sunday, what Jesus called his disciples to do and to be, and how that relates to us on a regular basis. So today we want to look at this important principle that Paul reflects to us in Galatians chapter 6. The idea of sowing and reaping. Now that's not a hard thing for us to understand, at least at a physical level, right here in farm country in the Midwest. We are moving into that time very quickly. Maybe for some farmers already have gotten there where the planting has started. They're putting seeds in the ground right now, or at least getting ready to. And we recognize very clearly that when we put corn seeds in the ground, we're going to get a harvest of corn. If we put tomato seeds in our garden, we're not going to get peppers out of those seeds. Whatever we plant is what we will get back. Whatever we sow, Paul says, we will reap. What we sometimes fail to understand is that that is not only true in a physical sense, but it is true in emotional, relational, mental, spiritual ways as well. In fact, that is such a universal principle that we have philosophies and even religious doctrines that reflect that all across the world. How many have heard of the idea of karma before? That idea of karma actually comes out of a couple or three different religions. And the principle is you get back in life what you put into it. Maybe you've heard the old American phrase along those lines, what goes around comes around. Anybody heard that before? You know, we recognize those realities and the universal nature of this principle that Paul is talking about. And yet, for some reason, when it comes down to our own personal lives, we don't often put two and two together. We don't maybe reflect deeply enough on how this kind of principle touches our lives. For example, on one occasion, I recall, had a really rough day at work, came home and took it out on the dog, took it out on family, and my daughter said, "Why is Dad so grumpy?" And my wife, recognizing that I'd had a bad day, kind of pulled everybody back and gave me some space to vent. But, you know, we do those things, we react in those ways, and then we wonder why people withdraw from us. Why maybe they're not quite as open or friendly, because we are sowing seeds of anger. And sometimes parents come to me and they're really surprised when their kids get called, when they get called into the school office because their kids have been involved in a fight or they're causing trouble at school. And we start thinking about and reflecting back, okay, well, what led up to this? What's going on? And we find out that some seeds have been sown into the family that are now being reaped. I find, unfortunately, that kids sometimes can be a mirror of what's really going on in our lives, for good or for bad. You know, not always the case, but often in our lives, those little things that maybe we are proud of or maybe that really annoy us about our kids, if we dig deeply enough, we find that, oh, that's part of the fruit that is now growing in their lives because that's what we planted in them. Again, that can be a positive thing. I can recall growing up. My dad taught at a university there close to us, and as a result had a lot of interaction with all kinds of different people and students and folks that would come in, even from out of country. He was always inviting them over to our house. it's such a blessing to me as I look back on that, because that gave me the skills and the ability to interact with all kinds of different people at all different levels. Young, old, foreigners, local people. It just was a wealth of experience for me. And I'm so grateful that my parents planted those seeds in me, because now I am bearing the fruit of that. I have the skills that I need and the desire even to connect with all different kinds of people in many different ways. So we hopefully are now sharing that, investing that into our kids and sowing those same good seeds. It seems like we see the fruit of bad things, mistakes that we've made, pop up in our lives and in our kids' lives much quicker than we see the seeds of good things that we're planting. And that can be very frustrating. But I want you to also reflect on this reality. Dandelions grow up in a night, and oak trees take years. In other words, those weeds, those negative things that crop up in folks' lives that we see in situations, in relationships, it's not surprising that those pop up immediately, because weeds pop up immediately. But good things, strong things like an oak tree, work in the same way. It takes a lot longer, takes a lot more nurturing, more protection early on. But as we continue to invest positively into people's lives, into situations, into our kids, whatever it may be, those oak trees also begin to grow and flourish. So continue to be encouraged in that. In those relationships, it's important for us to remember also that lack of attention, lack of planting of seeds, not just planting of good or bad, but lacking planting at all, can also make a difference. I remember the old Harry Chapin song. Maybe you remember Cats in the Cradle. And it's interesting because the singer, the writer of the song, reflects on how he had been so busy in his life that he really just wasn't even around to plant good things into his kids' lives. And yet, not doing that really was a planting in some ways. Because at the end of the song, the kids are too busy to spend time with him. And he says, at the end, I realized my boy had grown up to be just like me. And so it's important for us to be very intentional about the kinds of seeds that we plant, because we recognize this universal principle that Paul is telling us. God is woven right into the nature of all of creation, no matter what it is, whether it's physical, whether it's spiritual, whether it's relational. What we sow, we will reap. Now, another thing that I think we also fail to recognize in life is that is true of our relationship with God. And I want us to really reflect on this for a moment. Because so often in our lives, again, we get busy. God is just always there for us, and we assume that God, because He loves us and is merciful, He'll just kind of get over us not paying attention to Him. And so, like our loved ones that we feel will always be there, we take them for granted. We do the same thing with God, and we put our relationship with God on the back burner, and we, get involved in so many different things that are urgent and require our attention. And by the time we finish doing everything that everybody else is clamoring for in our lives, we're so tired we just go to bed. And that happens day after day after day. And one day we wake up and we feel distant from God. And we feel like our prayers are bouncing off the ceiling, that God is not listening. And we wonder where God is and if God even cares. And we forget about the universal principle of sowing and reaping. It's not that God is distant, it's that we have made ourselves distant. And it's not a surprise that God is not answering our prayers, because are we answering His call? What has God been speaking into our lives that we've completely ignored and walked away from? And yet we expect God to, like a genie in a bottle, just be there at our beck and call. We forget that this walk with God is also a relationship, and relationships, like a plant, need to be watered, need to be nurtured, need to be encouraged to see good fruit grow. It's incredibly important that we make the time to invest, to plant those seeds into all of our relationships, not just children, not just spouse, not just friends and other family, but also to plant those seeds and nurture those seeds and water those seeds in our relationship with God. When we make that time and make that extra effort, we begin to see good fruit flow. When we draw near to God, the Bible's promise is God draws near to us. What we sow, we will reap, both positively and negatively. That's true not only in relationship with God and others, but it's also true in our personal character development. God is wanting us, as we live as disciples, to become more and more like Jesus. And so, how do we become more and more like Jesus? The only way to do that is to spend more time and to do the things that Jesus did. I think about funny situations in my own experience, whether it is in my life or my kids' lives, even my wife's life. The more time I realize that I have hung around certain friends or family members, the more I pick up their quirks. Anybody ever experienced that before? Maybe you start saying things the way they do, or joking the way that they do, or whatever it may be. You just start to pick up those traits. And why is that? It's because we spend more time with them. Well, the same is true with Jesus. The more time that we spend with Jesus, the more we tend to become like Him. And if we're not spending that time, then we're not growing in that way. I don't want to belabor the point too much, but I do want to offer this image. Again, this is a universal principle. Out of the Cherokee culture right here in our own America, the Native American tribe had a parable that they called the parable of the two wolves. I don't know if you've ever heard that story, but their teaching was that everyone in their life has two wolves, a white wolf and a black wolf. And that black wolf represents all things negative associated with what crops up in our life, or those temptations or character qualities that we struggle with. Things like greed, selfish ambition, worry, laziness, revenge, hatred, offense, all these other things they associated with the black wolf. And the white wolf represented those positive things that we develop as a person. What the Bible calls the fruit of the Spirit: joy, peace, kindness, gentleness, love, compassion, any number of other things. And what they basically taught in that Cherokee culture was that whatever wolf we feed is the one that will grow. And so if we want the positive traits in our lives to grow and become more dominant and predominant that show forth in our character, in our relationships with others, in our interactions in the world, then that's what we need to engage in. That's what we need to feed. In other words, what we sow, we will reap. But if we begin to feed the black wolf with hatred, with revenge, with thoughts of offense and any other greed, selfish ambition, self-pity, whatever it may be, that's going to grow, and that's going to become more and more and more dominant in our lives. Romans 8 that Nick so graciously read for us a moment ago, Paul has this to say: those who live according to the flesh have their minds set on what the flesh desires. But those who live in accordance with the Spirit have their minds set on what the Spirit desires. The mind governed by the flesh leads to death, but the mind governed by the Spirit leads to life and peace. The mind governed by the flesh is hostile to God and does not submit to God's law. But those who are in the realm of the Spirit please God. Just another way of saying exactly what we've been talking about. And in a practical sense, what Paul reminds us is that what we focus on is what we become. That is how we really plant those seeds. We talked last week about our focus and how Eve, when she was in the garden, was led astray into sin by the devil because he tricked her into redirecting her focus off of God and God's goodness and to an object that he claimed was desirable and useful. And he took her mind and her heart through that redirection away from God and put it on something that was less than what God had for her. It's important for us to recognize what we are focusing on, what we are setting our minds on. Because as we set our minds, eventually so our hearts go. And as our hearts go, eventually so do our actions go. What we sow, we will reap. I talked to our kids about this, and actually I probably need to talk to myself about this even more. Sometimes we trick ourselves. Paul actually says in this passage in Galatians 6, do not be deceived. What you sow, you will reap. Sometimes we try to tell ourselves what we watch on TV, what we listen to in terms of music, the kind of people that we hang around, they don't affect me. They're not an influence on me. It's just some of these things, it's just make-believe. The books that we read, maybe the fictional books, even news that we watch on TV, that's not affecting me. Paul says otherwise. Because as we plant those seeds in our minds and hearts, good or bad, they begin to take root and grow. I wanted to offer today just a brief picture of what that might look like. This was a few years ago. Our son was watching a TV show called Daredevil. It was one of the Marvel superhero shows. And it's an interesting show. It's about a man that is blind but has supernatural instincts and reflexes and is kind of a martial arts trained person. And he ends up becoming a superhero in a sense that is sort of really more like a vigilante than a superhero. And I remember just kind of watching over Nate's shoulder one day this episode, and the hero of the story, Daredevil, goes into this particular old abandoned factory trying to solve some problem and help some people, and comes across one of the stereotypical big brute villains. And they get into a fight, and Daredevil, the hero, wins, and he has an opportunity to kill the villain or to be merciful and let him go. And he chooses to be merciful and not kill him. And the strangest thing happened in my own heart and mind as I was just watching this, again, over the shoulder of my son. I thought, oh, that's a big mistake, letting this guy live, because I've seen all the shows. These guys come back and he'll end up stabbing him in the back. He'll create problems in the future. He'll do more evil. He'll hurt more people. And all that was racing through my mind just in a split second as soon as he had made that decision to be merciful. And then the plot twist. On the show, this character, who was the big bad guy, the villain, starts crying. And it turns out that he was himself a victim. That he was mentally handicapped. And the reason that he was fighting the hero was because another villain had told him if he did not protect this workshop and keep all people out and do whatever he needed to do to stop them, then he was going to be hurt and his loved ones were going to be hurt. And that rocked me. And I started really reflecting, why would I, as a pastor, have this mentality, oh, you just need to kill these kind of people because they're always evil, they're always unredeemable. Why would my mind immediately go to something like that? And I realized it was because of the seeds that had been planted, because of what I had watched, because I had read, what I had heard about in the news. All these stories about these unredeemable people that just continue to create evil no matter what chances they're given. And I began to look at people and look at situations from a worldly perspective instead of from God's perspective. And it was influencing my whole view of the world. I had to do some repenting at that point and really come to God and ask Him to change me and to do some things to help me to see differently in my own life. So we need to be very careful, friends, what we are planting into our minds and hearts. Because whether we realize it or not, those seeds are going to create fruit, good or bad. That's why we really need to be intentional about what we're doing and what we're saying. On the bright side of that, as we sow good things into the lives of others, into our own hearts and minds, we do see great things that God brings. One last story and then we'll wrap up. A number of years ago, my wife and I were working with a young lady, and she had, through her own seed sowing, isolated herself and created a lot of problems with other people and with other relationships. And at one point, physically became very ill, ended up in the hospital. And my wife and I had been working with her and trying to help her and lead her to Christ. And I remember we went in to visit her at the hospital one day, and nobody was there. Not her family, no friends. We were the only ones, my wife and I, that came to visit her that whole time she was in the hospital, because she had driven away so many people. But the beautiful thing in that is that not long after that situation, she came to realize what she had done and how she had lived, and that she needed to make a difference, and she became a Christian. And she started going to church, and she invested herself into other people and began to really blossom and flourish. And roughly a year later, maybe a little bit more, she had another health relapse, ended up in the hospital again, almost the exact same hospital room there in Woodlawn in Rochester. And I'll never forget, my wife and I went to visit her like we had done before in the hospital, and we couldn't even get into the room. The whole room was full of people. From her family, from her church. And I remember so vividly thinking, wow, what a difference. Because she had changed and she had begun to invest into the lives of others. Now she had this kind of fruit in her life when she needed it most. It's not a coincidence that Paul tells us that we are not to be deceived. What we sow, we will reap. As we think about that today, I encourage you to reflect back on your own life. Think about what we need to continue to sow in a positive way, what we want to change in terms of sowing seeds that maybe weren't so great in the past, and working towards correcting maybe some of those issues. You know, there are always consequences for what we've done, what we've said. But we also, through the grace of God, can redeem those and change those situations with God's help. God brings forgiveness. God brings help changing situations. And so nothing is ever too late when it comes to God if we will start now planting those good seeds and working to correct the things in our lives that need to be corrected. Would you bow with me in prayer? Father, as we come to you today, we thank you for the opportunity to reflect on these ideas and understand this truth, this universal principle. We pray that you would forgive us where we need forgiveness, give us wisdom how we need to move forward, and help us to be intentional about planting good seeds in our lives, in our relationship with you, in our relationships with others, so that good fruit might result. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.